Hello, friends, and welcome back to Page Tuning, and welcome to the Friday Conversation. This week is Attack of the Steves. I have another Steve here with me this week. Steve, will you give us an introduction?
Sure. My name is Steve Clark, and I'm very happy to be here. I'm a New York-based writer, painter, and filmmaker. Um, Most recently, I've written a book of poems, and most recently, I've come out with a book of short stories called City Swimmers and Other Stories. And yeah, I'm just happy to be here.
Hey, thanks for making time. And tell us about your latest collection of short stories.
Well, this is my first collection of short stories, and it's a 10-story collection that just came out 2 weeks ago, and it's a story that um, is well, it's a collection of stories that came together. I started writing them in 2020,
Mhm.
and over the past couple of years, put it together and have sent it out. There's sort of stories that use New York as a point of departure, and they're a lot of fun to write. And now I'm just sort of getting them out in the world.
Oh, wow. There's New York seems to be a good place for stories. Lots of different stories. There's so many different cultures and people and such diversity there that it seems like it's a good place to kind of even be inspired.
Absolutely. I grew up in New York, and I was lucky enough when I was 25 to start working at a magazine called the Paris Review, which is a literary magazine founded by George Plimpton, who was a wonderful New York literary figure in the 50s with some of his friends in Paris. Um, he would usually say that the literary magazine was famously misnamed because it was no longer in Paris. He moved it back to his brownstone or black and white stone in New York on East 72nd Street. And it never reviewed anything because it was based on the idea of having writers speak about their own craft in their own words. In other words, not having reviews. So it was the Paris Review, which was no longer in Paris, didn't have reviews in it, but was bent on publishing the best new fiction alongside interviews with real masters
Hmm.
of the craft.
Wow. Sounds like a great place to learn and to grow and to hone your craft. What were some of the things you learned there that you look back on now?
Well, I learned that a lot of people write stories because there is a thing called the slush pile.
Hmm.
I think at that time, the Paris View was receiving about 16,000 short stories a year, of which it would pull, and it was a wonderful moment when suddenly a writer was found in the slush pile and published in the magazine. And that happened maybe 5 or 6 times a year. So the odds were very difficult to get in there. But when someone did, it was wonderful. I think that the great writer James Salter was published there early. Jay McInerney, who was there published there early, and there's a whole list of wonderful authors who got their first publications in there. Um, and besides that, it was just a really fun place to work. You got to George Plimpton was involved in lots of different things. He discovered a thing called participatory work. He created a thing called participatory journalism, where he'd he'd play for a football team and then write about it. He was kind of a professional amateur, and he'd get in the boxing ring with a professional and write about it. And he'd take these incredible beatings and write sort of elegantly about what it's like to step into this big arena. Ernest Hemingway called it the dark side of the life of Walter Mitty.
Hmm.
And George really got the magazine taking off because he claimed that the only person he ever saw buy the Paris Review was Ernest Hemingway. And he saw him buy it at Shakespeare and Co. in Paris and chased him down the street and begged him to do an interview. And there began a very long friendship between the two of them.
Wow. That's a that's a lot.
A lot of
The
stuff there.
yeah, the I'm curious about the slush pile with 16,000 stories per year. How does one go through the pile? How does that work?
Well, there would be I think about two readers every day, and you could have a weekly unpaid job there, and it was usually people getting their MFAs or who were interested in writing or getting their foot inside the door of a literary magazine, and they'd come and they'd work for free, and they'd go through the folders, probably one day a week, and so in totally at any moment you might have anywhere between 4 to 10 readers, and their job would just be to read all of these submissions and really, read them carefully and respond,
Hmm.
and sometimes develop relationships with the authors who would eventually get a piece in there or a piece somewhere else. It wasn't the most fun job to read all of those stories, but it was it was necessary.
Yeah. Yeah, it must be really tough. So the entire they would read the entire story and they would offer feedback too?
Well, you had sort of the ranking back then, at least, and this was a long time ago, but you get what was called an A slip, which was thanks for sending it, but we can't publish it, and a B slip, which were for stories that were a little closer, and it was please think of us for your next submission.
Hmm.
And then the next level would be a personal letter, which you could write to saying, hey, send your next stories directly to me. Or if something was really in contention, it would be put into a little bin called aptly the bin, and that those stories would be read by everybody in the office and commented upon.
Hmm.
And then once they're all commented upon, it would go upstairs, or George Plimpton would come downstairs, and he would be the final choice. Sometimes with some negotiation with the other editors, but he really had the final choice. And then that's the sort of long road from the slush pile into publication.
Yeah. It's a long road. That must be an honor to make it to be published.
Absolutely. It
Yeah.
was really fun, and to have those new writers come for the book party, and just it was really great to meet a lot of those people.
Wow. Yeah, so moving back a little bit, what started you out creatively? What was the why why is creativity, why is developing or telling stories or creating things, why is it important to you? What does it mean to you?
Well, I think it was always something that I felt I might be able to do and that I wanted to do. My mother's an artist, and she's a poet and a novelist,
Hmm.
and I grew up with a lot of words in the house. She's Spanish. She got a scholarship to come to the States for college and met my father. They got married, and they were married for 7 years and divorced, and we all still lived in New York close by. And so I grew up in my mother's house, and books were important, writing was important, poetry was important, and I got more seriously into it when I got to college. And and I had a friend who was in a writing course, and I remember seeing one of his poems and saying, "Hey, I want to do that, or I think I can do that." And luckily, I got into the course, was really just felt crazily in love with writing poetry,
Hmm.
and kind of didn't look back from there. And that was my junior year in college. So I
Oh wow.
TA'd the course. I did some independent studies. After that, I went to some writers' conferences, and then I got a job in the Paris Review. And so it just kind of kept moving forward in that way.
Wow. And you mentioned poetry, and I love poetry. I think it's underappreciated. It's not it's there's so many different things you can do with poetry. It's so versatile. You can do there's it's such a fun playground to be in. Why do you write poetry? Why is poetry what does it draw you in?
I think you sort of nailed it, and it's because there's sort of rules, but they're not rules, and it's I think Bukowski said he wrote poetry because it was a great place to scream a little bit, and and so you can scream in it, you can do anything, any of the vast array of the human emotions, whether conflicting or happy or whatever, they all can go in there, and so it's kind of this vast canvas that you can just do whatever you want, and you can show it to people, you don't have to show it to people, you can be in the literary world, you don't have to be in the literary world. And I find also, funny enough, I find a lot of people who you never would think wrote poetry actually do secretly write it, and and they don't show it to people. So I just I got really into reading all these poets. And then I was lucky enough after college to get into a writers conference in Squaw Valley, and I met all of these people who I'd been reading in college. These poets who I loved at the time and still do, like Sharon Olds, Galway Canal, Robert Haas. And it was kind of surreal to meet these people, because when you're reading them in college and you're holding these precious books in your hands, you don't feel that actual people are writing them. They feel so kind of like rem- close but removed
Yeah.
in the actual making of them. So that was kind of eye opening. Like, oh well, these are just people writing poetry, and you can do that. And so I was really and still am. And I was, whenever someone asks me about the different creative things I do, I always say that poetry is always, for me, the absolute core of what I do, whether it's painting or making film. It's still, that's what I always want to come back to, or I'm drawn to, and that's where I feel the most freedom and the most. Would you? The question is, would you do this if no one ever read it? And the answer is, I would. Now, I don't know if I'd ever make a movie if no one would ever watch it. I don't know if I'd make a painting if no one would ever see it.
Hmm.
Of course, it's better when you can share it with other people, though.
Hmm. When so you mentioned you would still write it, but you wouldn't necessarily create like paint a painting or create a movie or a film. Is it because of the catharsis, the kind of the therapy that goes into it when you write poetry? And if so, why is that different with words versus art, a visual art?
I don't think it's necessarily different, but it is for me. There's something about putting a handle or putting experience into words, which is just necessary for me to um, enjoy it, or maybe it's a compulsion. I don't know what it is, but it feels that I have to do it, and it makes me feel. I guess it is cathartic, but it also, there's a pleasure in doing it that is so necessary, and for me fundamental to what it is to be human, to have that kind of creative pleasure where you're interacting with experience and coming out with something that is um, manageable or comprehensible or pleasurable to yourself. And with a film, first of all, it's just so many people involved in the film, um,
Yeah.
and that it's by by its nature a collaborative medium. And painting, I could see how people just draw in their notebooks for themselves, but I don't know. There's something more public about going to my studio and making these big paintings and people walking through and commenting on them than it is with me for poetry.
What is your creative process when you sit down to write a poem? What are kind of the way that you structure it, or do you just flow it? What is your creative process?
For me, I just sit down and go for it, and I don't really know how it's going to end. And most of that stuff is doesn't really go anywhere. So I'll get it all out, just get it all out, and then I'll step away from it for a while. And sometimes that first natural explosion or whatever it is uh, does something cool, and or sometimes it's just, oh, this is not something that I want to continue to work on. But a lot of times I'll go back and work on it and maybe refine a little thing, but I don't like to change too much, because I have gone through and I've murdered a fair amount of poems from my youth unintentionally by thinking that a poem had to be a certain way or being
Hmm.
self-conscious about how it turned out. Sometimes the most unfinished, raw edged ones are the ones that I like, not only my poetry, but also in earlier books of more established poets I like too.
Mhm.
Um, so I try not to kill them too much.
Yes, yeah, it's great about poetry, and sometimes even the seemingly unfinished poem is still effective. You don't have to have a beginning, middle, and end. It can be whatever you want it to be.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, it's a great art form. On from the sales and marketing side, is it difficult to pitch poetry, or what is that like from, I know it's the unfun side, but what is that
Sure.
like?
Well, it's kind of weird now because there's so many magazines that publish poetry. It's kind of just sort of mind-boggling that there are
Hmm.
just thousands of places and thousands and so many people write poetry. And it can be a little overwhelming because when you are just, I remember being in those slush piles and being like, I don't know what's good anymore. I don't know. Am I being moved by this? Am I just, is this made me brain dead, or am I feeling so? That's a hard question because there really is so many places. There's so many poems, and I need to just sort of step back a little bit, take a break from it, not read it, go back to books that I just loved from the beginning, and they sort of re-inspire you and kickstart that engine again. Because
Hmm.
I think if you're too much in the world of contemporary poems, where it's like whoa, 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 it's a lot. It's really a
Yeah.
lot. In terms of the book publishing, I published my first my book in Spain with
Hmm.
a great publisher called Huerga y Fierro. My mother's a poet, so she had translated the book of poems into Spanish. So
Hmm.
we published that in an English and Spanish English and Spanish version. So that was the story with that book. But going forward, you know, I'm not sure. You just sort of send them out. You hope and try and get them out there.
It's such a tough gig to stand out and to get your book in the right people's hands, because there's so many books being published every year that it's tough.
It's so many. There's so many tiny press. I remember being at the Paris Review, and you get advanced copies from all these books, and it was hard to just even those that had become books. It was still hard to go through all of those, um, and it's hard to sit down and just read books of poems at a time because they need breath around
Yeah.
them. They need space around them. So you can just can be too much of a too much of a dessert or something. You can't have it all the time, every meal.
Yeah, it's true. It's hard to really get the impact if you read one after another. You almost have to read it and absorb it and take it in and kind of swim in it to really feel it.
I think so. I think so.
Yeah.
And that's what's fun about going into, reading a specific poet for a certain amount of time. You can sort of be with that creative mind for a while, that creative spirit. And so I kind of like to do that, but I also like to jump around a lot. It's just you just reminded me. I when I was at the Paris Review, I like to memorize poems, and I said to the office, said, "Hey guys, once a week we're going to memorize a poem. Okay, it's going to be really cool. We're going to pick a poem, memorize it." And for the first week, everyone said, "Yeah, let's do it." The second week, nobody was into it except for this one intern we had. His name, weirdly enough, was Dan Glover, or is Dan Glover, not the actor. But he was this really bright guy. He went to Harvard. He graduated summa cum laude. He was just incredibly bright, and he was super competitive. So he and I would memorize a poem every week, and it got to the point where we just kept memorizing and memorizing. And I remember it was right before a Christmas break, and we decided to memorize The Wasteland, which is something like 334 lines, T.S.
Hmm.
Eliot's poem. And so he memorized this whole thing, and I was like, he's coming back from Christmas, I got this memorized, and his visa had expired, and he
Oh,
couldn't get in the country. And so I was all ready, and he didn't get in the country for another 6 months, but I had to rememorize that poem. But so what I did is I had this binder of all of my favorite poems that I'd memorized over the course of a few years with him, and just my favorite ones. And I was so tired of going into my bookshelf and taking out a book, looking for that specific poem. And so I took this small room in my house and I just papered the whole room with all of those poems that were my favorite poems. So there's a little, it's actually a bathroom, I'm embarrassed to say now, but it just papered in all of my favorite poems from from Dante to who knows to Milos to Rimbaud to Octavio Paz. They're all in this wonderful bathroom. So people will walk into my bathroom and be like, "I do not want to leave this room because I can do a lot of reading in here."
definitely. If excuse me, if someone's listening who isn't familiar with poetry, doesn't really know where to start, where would you suggest someone start? to get into poetry?
Wow, that's sort of, I would ask them what books they liked and which ones they read. But I mean, there's some poems that are just so beautiful. I mean, a lot of people start out with Pablo Neruda's 20 love poems because it's just hard not to fall in love with them, and they just hold over time. Um, for me, I would have been happy to start there. Or there are other poets who are just sort of, if you like more gritty, sort of urban, beautiful love poems. The guy named Etheridge Knight was just an incredible poet. Um, I think that they sort of, everybody starts in school at some point, and sometimes it's off-putting what they learn in school, but if they get that bug for it, there's just endless diving to do.
Yeah, it never ends. I've always wanted to read Dante's Inferno. I'm just intimidated by it because it just, I don't know, it just feels like a like I'm not worthy, or I'm not able to. I wouldn't take it. I don't know why. It's just like this mental thing. But yeah, I'd love to read it one day.
And you'd
Definitely.
also, the thing is, you'd have to pick which translation you want to do, because there's a whole book of different poets translating different stanzas from it. And some are rhyming, with 3 line stanzas, and some aren't, and some are simple, and some are super complicated. And it really makes a huge difference which translation you would read. They're
Hmm.
just completely different sensibilities. Unless you know Italian, then you could just do that.
Yeah, unfortunately, no.
That was we did memorize the beginning of that too, of
Wow,
Dante's Inferno.
wow.
But I love that. I mean, I love it too. Um, so I understand that urge.
When your book was translated, was it difficult, or was there a lot of edits that needed to be done to make it flow as smooth, or was it just a word for word translation?
It's a sort of complicated book of poems because there are a lot of words that are used that are in different ways than it was complicated to
Hmm.
translate. So it was a lot of my mother, who's a poet. She translated along with her husband, who was also a poet. So you can
Wow.
imagine a lot of very boisterous Spanish conversations about what words should be used. A lot of uh, you know familial familial friction. Let's call it familial friction over how the book would be translated. But we did get there, and I was very lucky because if someone else had translated in Spanish, I probably wouldn't have had as much of a say, or I wouldn't have been as bold in my need for how it should be done.
Hmm. Well, it's great to have those resources. I mean, it's great to have so many people's brains you can pick and get feedback from. Do you often send your work to your mom, or to ask for her feedback?
Well, it was only for the translation. This and I translated one of her books called Atisbos, which just we just presented the Madrid Book Fair. I translated her book, but it's funny you say that. We have a very um, unusual mother-son relationship because she was very young. She was divorced young, so we were growing up in a household. She was almost like a sister in New
Hmm.
York. And it's funny you asked that because a year ago, she's 80 now, and a year ago I wrote her uh, on a Friday. I wrote her a paragraph about being 7 years old and watching her get dressed to go to Studio 54, and she'd say, "Should I wear this leopard tie or should I wear this high heel?" And I'd always be like, "No, wear this or wear that." And then I wrote her this page, and I said, what we're gonna do is I'm gonna write you something, and then the following week you're gonna write me whatever you want. You can write me a response to what I'm gonna write. You can write me a poem. You can write me something that has nothing to do with it. And my mother, being very exuberant, wrote me back right away a whole thing. So this thing that was supposed to go over about a year just exploded into what has become this joint memoir of New York in the 80s, about a mother and son relationship which was very unusual for the time, a familial psychological structure, sort of contemplation of death and what it means. So we wrote this after a year. We realized, oh my God, we have a book here, and so we gave it to this publisher that we really love in Spain, who's going to bring it out in March. So,
Oh wow, that's
so that's
awesome.
a
That's so
strange
cool.
answer to your question, but I guess we do work together, or we're certainly working together on this.
Wow, that's so neat that just kind of happened just by
Yeah.
writing back and forth. It was like a writing exercise turned into a book.
Yeah, and it was an interesting time because it's growing up in the eight. I'm 54. It was growing up in the 80s in New York, and it was just sort of very lively. And she was very young and out on the town, and I was, she was writing poetry, and I was sort of coming into my adolescence, which is another thing to do when you're, in the 80s in New York was very different than it is now. So there's a lot of stuff in there for sure.
Wow, that's really neat. That's really cool. We talk about poetry and short fiction. With short fiction, I think a lot of people think, well, it's a short story, so it's easy to write because it's short. It can get in and get out. But it's very difficult to write an effective short story. What is your process writing short fiction? Do you have a structure, or do you have certain goalposts that you want to hit, or what are your kind of your process?
I my process is I wake up before my kids wake up, so they go to school at 7:30. I try and wake up around 5:30, and I like to work from a little before 6 until they go to school at 7:30. So I have this hour and a half, and my process is I have no idea what's going to happen when I sit down, and I think that there's no way nothing is going to happen. But weirdly, after an hour and a half each day, a lot of stuff does happen. And for me, I think that Raymond Carver said I use a little bit of autobiography and a lot of imagination. And I always start with some little kernel of something. And suddenly, when it's going well, those characters get away from me and interact in ways that I really never thought they would. And suddenly we're on this great, if it's going well, again, we're on this great sort of like trip together. And I'm sort of watching what they're doing. And something happens. Now, that's sort of the first urge, and then I'll continue that and go for as long as they will take me there. And then I'll go back and realize, okay, this was a silly boondoggle, or hey, this is actually a story, and
Hmm.
now let's craft this, let's fix it up, let's move something. Maybe we want to combine this story with a little bit of that story until they feel like it was meant, but weird enough to surprise. And and if I get there, I feel like I have a story.
Hmm.
And so that's how I've been working, or at least how I worked on this book of short stories.
So when you're writing, whether it's a short story or a poem or a novel or whatever it is you're writing, how do you know when it's good? Do you take a step back? Do you let it breathe? Do you know immediately if this isn't working? Or what is your kind of what's your how do you determine what's worth working on more or trashing and starting over again?
Well, the process for this book, I have a very good friend who I've been friends with for 30 years, who's a playwright in New York, and we've been reading each other our stuff for almost 30 years. And it's really a weird thing that happens. But when I when I read my work to her, I know as I'm reading it out loud to somebody, it's something about reading out loud to somebody who you respect, that all the things that you were trying to get away with, or that were kind of cringy and like, oh, that's you creeping in there and gross. Um, they kind of, they just come out, and you just know when you read it to someone whether it's going to work or not. And that I'm very lucky to have that. And and at the times that I haven't had that, when I finish a story, I'll read it into my phone in a voice memo, and then I'll just sit back and I'll listen to it. And invariably, I change some words here and there, but that's part of the process. Part of the process is first reading it to somebody, because you can't hide behind you know these vague faces that you're not seeing. They're watching you read it, and so you're getting their reaction right away. But you're also able to listen to yourself read it to somebody.
Hmm.
And that's when, if you do that enough times, you can get to the point where you can feel safe that at least you're happy with it. And finally, that's kind of what has to happen because you have no control over whether other people are.
So when someone asks you for feedback or to listen to them read their stories to you, is it difficult to give feedback sometimes because they can be so personal to the person who wrote it, and everyone reacts differently to kind of constructive criticism. What is your approach to that? To For someone who is a little sensitive to receiving constructive criticism? What is your approach, or how do you present that to them?
If someone's asking me,
Hmm.
I like to have them read it to me because usually they will know
Hmm.
what's wrong with it or what needs help or what's weak before I even have to say it.
Hmm.
And I think that it's very difficult to hear criticism, especially when you're starting off and when you have those insecurities and there's defensiveness and all that. But there's always a gentle way to tell the truth, and it's sort of finding that gentle way to to sort of lead them. And also there's also humor. You can say, well, you can I think you can bring people to at least what you would do, because all you can do is say, look, you're going to do it your way. But what I would do is if it were my story, that's all I can tell you is I would cut out these things. And all an editor is trying to do is really, although I'm saying it's what I would do, I'm saying that that's what I see the writing wants to be for
Hmm.
them. And that's what a good editor does. They're sort of these gentle helpers um, that say, "You don't? Do you really mean that? Do you really? Is that really?" And and they're invaluable. They're just incredible.
Hmm. And so all the creative outlets you have is a little amazing to me. It's wonderful. You've also made an indie film, is that correct?
Yeah. So I've written, directed, co-written, directed, and produced 3 films.
Wow.
And and the second film is one that is called Night Has Settled, which is I just told you about the book I did with my mother, which is called just Mother and Son. But that is a really that has a lot of autobiography in it of growing up in New York in the '80s, and that's a portrait of a kid going through a lot of stuff, turning 13, and um, and that is a real New York indie, low budget movie. That was a lot of fun to make, and it was very low budget, but I had a really great time making that film.
So going from a solitary activity like writing and then going into making a film and having all the different people involved in it and all the different personalities, and what was that like to go from having kind of your own world and living in it to having so many other people involved?
Well, I say it's like crop rotation because sitting in a room and writing poetry on your own can also get you crazy. So I like to after, and it's kind of funny because it's almost every 6 years. I say, "Oh, I'm ready for another movie," because it's so chaotic. There's so many people. It's this long editing process. Then you have to sell it. That is completely. It can. It really can wear you down. So I love retreating from that back into poetry, where you kind of refuel. But I do like to go and make a movie with a lot of people because it's this joint, wonderful act of insanity. And especially when you're making a movie with a budget of 250, $300,000 in New York, you're gonna border on illegal on illegal stuff. I mean, you're gonna hail a cab and you're gonna shoot in the subway. You're gonna do some stuff you're probably not supposed to, which is a lot of fun. But they're incredibly different. And to answer your question, is I have a mother who is a Spanish poet. I have a father who is an American businessman. There could not be two more opposite people around, although they've always gotten along. But I say that to say I have a lot of contradictions inside. So I need a lot of different things. There's quite a different facets in there that I need to satisfy. So poetry is one, but also getting out there and working with other people and collaborating is another. So I really enjoy um, both of those extremes, and they are extremes. Poetry to a film, they're pretty extreme.
Yeah, sounds like it. So for $250,000, just to kind of get an idea, what if you have that budget, kind of what would you think off the bat is covered, and you're good? Is it does it cover actors? Does it cover?
Oh,
Um,
that's for. I mean, this was in 2000 and this movie came out in 2014.
hmm,
You had to make the whole movie for that.
yeah.
So you are you are. people aren't getting paid a lot of money. I could only do it because I was working with a cinematographer who was also a documentary filmmaker. So when they said, "Oh, we also have a guy fly to Chile," the kid at the end of the movie flies to Chile and say, "Okay," everybody says, "Well, we're going to have to build an airplane door and it's going to cost this and this." He goes, "No, we're not. We're going to fly to Boston." And everyone's like, "You're what?" And so you get on a flight and you get the kid on the flight and you're filming on a on a flight to Boston, and the stewardess is going, "What are you doing?" We said, "Oh, just a home, no, nothing, no big deal." And suddenly you have what would cost any other production quite a bit of money. You got it for like $150 for some shuttle tickets. So without him, there's no way that that would have happened.
That's you had to be creative in that aspect too, right? To stretch it and to find ways to get the shots you want, but still save money in the budget.
Absolutely, and for the film at that level, there are so many adventure stories uh, that they're sort of endless. The kind of craziness that happens on a film like that to get it done, but it's a lot of fun if you're doing it with the right people. Have the same mentality of we're going to do this no matter what, and it's going to be fun. It's going to be a little uncomfortable, but we're going to make a movie that we like by the end of the day, and so that's what we did.
Wow. Does it ever get easier? I know you've done 3 of them. Does it get easier or does it seem to get harder?
I My experience is the more people that get involved and the more money, although everyone tells you it gets easier, I don't think it doesn't seem to get easier. It gets sort of more bureaucratic
Hmm.
and people want more, need more, rightfully so, because you don't want to, no one can survive on doing a film budget for 250. But but it's just a lot more. There are a lot more rules
Hmm.
that you have to follow. That's not to say that if someone were going to give you a pile of money, you shouldn't go make a movie for it. Yeah, that's great, but it there there's a give and take, and then the real payment for me, at least at the end of the day, is you just want to make the movie that you want to make.
Hmm.
So if you spend all that time and people are giving you all this money, but then you make a movie that you don't like or that you're not happy with, then you don't get the full payment that you deserve.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I would think it'd get more complicated with more people, more money. And I think we see that with major studios now is all the money that's involved and the too many people are interfering and it just becomes a mess from the creative outlet, from the creative side to the business side. Those it's hard to to equal out.
Yeah, I think so. I think it's very difficult. And then suddenly someone who has not, you know, they're just everyone's putting their opinion in, and and some opinions are great, and you should never say no to a better idea as long as it is helping your idea, not something that is kind of diminishing it or fading it out.
Yeah. Yeah, it's really tough. Do you have any fun stories to share during your filmmaking experience?
Well, on that independent film, um, we were supposed to. The producer told me, he said, tomorrow, the day, just so you know, because we've been making all the days, he said tomorrow is impossible. You have to shoot in a deli, then we're going to shoot on the Met steps. Not totally allowed to, but we were going to do that, and we were going to film all these places. And at 6 in the morning I got a phone call, and Obama was in town, and one of our PAs had driven the wardrobe truck. I don't know how well you know Manhattan, but there's a little tunnel going into Park Avenue, and he didn't realize that the wardrobe truck doesn't fit into the tunnel. So on his way uptown to Delhi, he wedged our wardrobe truck while Obama's in town into that, and we had a guy that we just called the fixer, and he was just like our friend. He's like, and we just said, he said the wardrobe truck is stuck in a tunnel, and he said we just said just go deal with it. So he goes, you want me to deal with it? Okay, I'll go deal with it. And so the cops are there. This poor young kid who's a PA is in tears. He's like, oh, I'm going to lose my job. There's all those hard things, and the cops were laughing because the cops were just like, man, you really screwed up. He goes, we'll buy you a drink because there's no way you have your job. And so my friend showed up, and they couldn't, since it was one of those trucks that you have to pick up the back, you have to lift it. It was stuck in the tunnel, so he couldn't get anything out.
Mm.
And so he bought a chainsaw and cut a hole in the truck, was throwing wardrobe out of it. cops were helping because they thought it was so hilarious, and we actually got to shoot that day. So things like that are sort of independent horror stories, but they make for for fun memories.
Yeah, they're funny now. I'm sure at the time it was a stressful time, but yeah,
A little
there's
stressful.
yeah. Well, I have a couple of questions there for you. I'd like to ask all of my guests. The first one being, do you have any favorite family recipes?
Well, my wife is a great cook. Her family is, and my Spanish side are really, really into food, and their uh, parents, grandparents. And so I'm not a cook. I can make burgers and eggs. That's basically it. But there's one thing that I do love, and it's from my Spanish great grandmother. And I won't be able to tell you how to make it, but it involves, it's called huevos Margot. Her name was Margot. Huevos is eggs.
Hmm.
And she would take Gruyere cheese with eggs, stir it up. I don't know how she did it with sort of a souffle. Take a baguette, put it in a pan with butter, put black truffle over the baguette, put the egg, Gruyere, and parsley on top. Super simple, but I do dig it.
Wow, that sounds really good.
Made me hungry.
Yeah, no, sorry. Another thing, another one of my questions is: was there ever a hobby or thing that you were excited to try, but when you tried it, you did not enjoy it?
Hobby or thing that well, I'll tell you a hobby or thing that I want to do that I just wasn't good at, and that was music. So,
Hmm.
uh, I do enjoy it. You know, I was got obsessed with playing guitar when I was about 15. My best friend is a terrific indie songwriter, and you know when I was like, I so want to be good at this, but I'm just not musical. I wish I was. So I still continue to play, but it's with the knowledge that I'm not as musical as I would like to be. I'm passable, but not. You know, it's kind of sad. You know, you feel like, oh, I'm so glad that I didn't pursue that, always knowing that deep down that you're just not very good.
Yeah.
It'll be constant sort of like, oh, not good.
Yeah.
So, in terms of hobbies that I didn't like, I don't know. I never kind of have enjoyed the hobbies I pursued. So I don't think I have one of those.
Do you have, or do you listen to music while you write?
No,
No.
I don't. I like that. I have enough music going on in my house for the dog, the children, the two boys running in circles. There's a lot of music. I I listen to music when I paint.
Hmm.
I listen to I love Spanish guitar, Paco
Oh, okay.
Cia, Andres Segovia. I so when I walk into my studio, I put that music on and I feel like I'm at home. That's my Spanish blood talking to me.
Nice. That's you can't really beat Spanish guitar for kind of to get in the zone.
I completely agree.
Yeah. And the last question I have for you, and I think it's interesting, the first job everyone has and how that shapes them through their lives. But what was your first job, and what did you learn from that experience?
Well, I'm lucky this one didn't shape me
Okay.
because my father um, my father sent me to New Jersey when I was 12 to work in a company that he had invested in or something, and it was or he had an affiliation with it, and it was a military spare parts company in New Jersey. I grew up in Manhattan. This was not music to my ears when I found out that this job was given to me, and I was 11 or 12, and it was a factory, and I learned later that I was staying with one of the heads of the company. I don't know if he was the owner. He was one of the no, he was like the president of the company who was getting divorced from his wife at the time. So all he wanted to do was be at work.
Hmm.
So we were the first people there and the last people to leave. And that meant getting there maybe 6:30 and leaving at 8:30. So 14 hours a day. Back then the minimum wage was $3.35. It was 1982.
Oof.
And I was 11 or 12, and I remember one day all I was doing was sandpapering off of a cylinder made in the UK. Now, why they were doing this, I do not know. Another day, I was taking two pieces of microfiche, one from one pile, one from another, and putting them in an envelope, and doing that for 12 to 14 hours.
Wow.
So I learned from this job that I could do this kind of work because I did it and I was not bad. The guy was like, "Oh, he can come work for us anytime." But I realized that this was not exactly the work I want to do.
I guess that's valuable too, to know what those can be motivators to not end up doing that thing.
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
Yeah. But thank you so much. It's been a pleasure to talk to you. And for those who are listening, where can people find more about you and your work?
Well, the new book, City Swimmers and Other Stories, that's available. Easiest way is probably Barnes and Noble or Amazon, and on my website, steveclark.com, or that's probably the easiest way.
Awesome. Well, again, thank you so much. It's been great to talk to you. Thanks for making
Re-
time.
Really fun to talk to you, and good luck with all.
All right. Thank you.
Take care. Bye bye.
Bye bye.